if you are back in the room, if you could either put your video on or give me a thumbs up so I can tell if we've got most folks, if most folks have returned, that would be wonderful. We'd sure appreciate that. Nice to see you back. Thank you for those thumbs ups. And for people who are joining us on the live stream, we're really glad that you are watching and observing and listening in on this really interesting conversation and the presentations. Just a reminder, we will have a public comment opportunity coming up around 4 o'clock. And the break that we take before that, we will provide you the information for how you can come into our Zoom room here and provide that public comment. So if you are listening in on the live stream and you'd like to make public comment, we'll be sure to give you a heads up about how to link in to the Zoom here and enable you to do that. So
did you see the, excuse me, Susan, did you see the message from Glenn Blackman who says it says host has stopped my video? So maybe you or Lauren or someone can look at that.
Thank you. I see your video though, Glenn.
Yeah, I think somebody fixed it. So thank you to whoever did that.
There we go.
And thanks for letting us know. We appreciate that. Yeah, sometimes when we're on break, we just shut off all the videos, and that's what might have happened to you, Glenn. So apologize if that was the case. All right, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to mention after, again, just welcoming everybody back is if you haven't had a chance to jump into the mural, that is in our chat. And if I think I'm going to ask Lauren to cut and paste that in again, only because I think there are some of you that left the Zoom room and came back in, and sometimes you're not able to come back into the chat in quite the same way. So Lauren, if you wouldn't mind cutting and pasting that mural link back in, I'd like people just to continue to take advantage of that being a tool for you to kind of capture some of the key points that you are hearing. We saw some really interesting things for the first presentation and the first panel that people have noted there. So please avail yourself of that opportunity to kind of park some things that you might be thinking about, get them at a place where when we do have the discussion later this afternoon, you will be able to remember those things that you were thinking of at the time. So having said that, I believe what we are ready to do is hop into our second panel. And this panel is focused around people who have interest in the renewable energy area. And so this includes Renewables Northwest, Avangrid, and Climate Solutions. So Katie Ware with Renewable Northwest, Anders Bisgaard with Avangrid, and Vlad Gutman-Britton with Climate Solutions are the panelists. And I'm presuming that you are going in the order in which you are listed. However, if you choose to do that differently, that is a-okay with us. Just proceed how you would wish. And Katie, are you leading off?
It would be fine with me. Thanks, okay. Susan.
So I would just like to stop here and also make sure that folks know that, and I believe Anders Bisgaard is now a member of the working group since we added the renewable energy representation, and that Katie Ware from Renewables Northwest is operating as the alternate. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Maybe Joe can answer that one.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, thanks. I'm not seeing that Anders is present yet. Can we verify that?
We are, and actually, thank you for mentioning that. Lauren had identified that Anders wasn't with us in the morning, so I think she's trying to follow up with him.
Yeah, I'm still not seeing him, and we've pinged him, so hopefully he'll join any minute.
Yeah, I left him a message as well. So
okay. So, and thank you, Kathleen, for mentioning that and clarifying that. So Katie, will lead off with you, and then if Anders joins us, great. And either way, Vlad will come to you next, I think. And I believe what I understand is you don't have slides. You were just going to talk through things with the group. Is that right?
That's right for me. I think that's right for Vlad,
Okay.
and probably Anders if he joins.
Great, then
Hopefully
go
that's okay.
ahead. Yeah, that'll be fine. We've got the framing questions around the agenda that we had asked you to consider as well. So turn it over to you, Katie.
Perfect. And what I will talk about is really just a complete answer to those framing questions. So my name is Katie Ware. I am the Washington Policy Manager for Renewable Northwest. Renewable Northwest is a nonprofit renewable energy advocacy organization. And our mission is to decarbonize the region by accelerating the transition to renewable electricity. You can imagine most of our work in Washington overlaps with CETA-related advocacy. Renewable Northwest has been and will continue to be active throughout the implementation of CETA, including through various rulemakings at the state agencies and utility resource planning processes. The rules implementing the law and the utilities compliance efforts are key to reaching CETA standards and achieving real decarbonization. So moving to the meat of the discussion, a lot of work went into the development of the 2021 State Energy Strategy, and I think it's a great place to anchor this conversation. Others on the call appear to agree, as it's been mentioned a handful of times today. The State Energy Strategy finds that to achieve 100% clean electricity by 2045, there must be an acceleration of investment in renewable resources and transmission. And in order to realize full resource and geographic diversity, which will bring down costs, we must take a regional approach to new investment in infrastructure, coordinating with neighboring states during planning. That's why I mentioned at the top of the call that maybe some sort of regional framing should be added to the charter, because I think that's important, and that aligns with recommendations made in the State Energy Strategy. I also think it's important to keep an eye on the potential for regional market expansion, as that development should pay off in cost savings over CETA's timeline, as well as meaningful resource adequacy improvements. The strategy looked at 5 decarbonization scenarios, and a key takeaway from all the scenarios is that greater interconnection among the 11 Western states and improved regional coordination is vital to lowering overall decarbonization costs. I also want to mention something that was released recently, the 2021 draft power plan, in which the council did not specifically study the expansion of the transmission system, but they ultimately recommended that the region work together to run such a study, which is interesting. And I think that until we have this study, we can do other things like look at resource maps and costs to judge where points of congestion may be. Looking in state, our strongest solar and wind resources are in Eastern Washington, and clean generation in the East needs to be brought west. And clearly this is in contrast to other recommendations made today, specifically the recommendation to build generation close to load. That generation works really well for fossil fuels, but obviously not as well for resources that perform much better where it's windy and sunny. One other point on this that I wanted to call attention to is that these clean resources are often located in rural areas where communities would really benefit from the tax benefits these projects bring. So we have to weigh cost and benefits. And the State Energy Strategy is one place you can look to find a specific scenario that clearly shows we would be at a disadvantage not to pursue full geographic diversity of clean resources. So that's state. Looking regionally, points of congestion limiting the movement of Southwest solar and Northwest wind, particularly in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, will become increasingly important. Washington Utilities IRPs and presentations today support this. And the current national focus on offshore wind may indicate that resource could become cost competitive earlier than previously thought, meaning we should start thinking about investment in transmission to access it. Okay, so that's the state efforts covered as far as I can see it now. And I also wanted to touch on utility planning efforts, because I think there may be near-term efficiencies to be gained there. For example, in PSE's 2021 IRP, the company ran a sensitivity to explore firm transmission as a percentage of resource nameplate capacity, given renewables often generate below their maximum outputs. PSE's results for that scenario indicated there may be some cost savings with securing firm transmission as a percentage of nameplate capacity, but the company ultimately didn't feel the savings would add materially to IRP portfolio development. So they didn't pursue that. And we still recommend that PSE and others continue exploring solutions like that to get at transmission underutilization. We also look forward to other modeling efforts at PSE and other utilities related to co-location of wind and solar with shared limited capacity, transmission capacity, due to the complementary relationship between the generation profiles of those resources. So yeah, to sum, I think that there's a lot of potential in the modeling efforts of the utilities to get at some of these inefficiencies and underutilizations. So I wanted to call attention to that because even though maybe it's not something we can really get at in the recommendations for the report, maybe we can, maybe that is possible, but I do think it's important to consider all realms of impact that we can make. And these are my initial thoughts. I know this is short compared to other presentations given today, but I kept it specific to the framing questions, and I look forward to contributing to other topics in future meetings. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate that. And nothing wrong with having a shorter presentation. I'm sure you'll be asked lots of questions. So we'll try to make up your time that way. So thank you for that. Vlad, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I'm Vlad Gutman-Britton. I'm the Washington State Director at Climate Solutions. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the group to participate in this and the panel. Climate Solutions, we do work in Washington and in Oregon. We're a clean energy nonprofit dedicated to accelerating solutions to the climate crisis. Our overwhelming focus is on energy versus other types of emissions, which are also pretty important. And so decarbonizing the sort of energy economy in our two states is our kind of core mission. Climate Solutions has been a lead advocate on most of the major, or a part of the lead advocacy. It has had a leading advocacy role on many of the major policies that have been adopted in the state over the last few years that are fundamentally driving the likely increase in demand for electricity, and in particular for renewable electricity, which is what necessitates a lot of the this transmission discussion. So we're deeply involved in CETA, but also Clean Fuel Standard and the Climate Commitment Act, all of which are going to contribute to a move in the direction that Glenn in particular has described on behalf of Commerce as part of the state energy strategy. We do that work in Oregon as well. My counterparts down there were heavily involved in the drafting and the passage of their 100% clean electricity law, which obviously also contributes to the same fundamental regional dynamics that we've heard so much about in terms of need for renewables and new renewables and for the capacity to bring them from where they're generated to where they need to be used. I think from our perspective, we see a really high priority for utility scale generation. I share the sort of concern that Katie kind of identified about, generation close to load is great and it's ideal, but given the sort of, resource characteristics and the climate in the places where we have load in the Northwest, that functionally means most of the time will mean fossil fuels. There are some resources, there are some, variable renewable resources that can be cited in Western Washington. There are some non-variable renewable resources that can be cited in small quantities, potentially like geothermal and things like that in Western Washington that is closer to load centers. But fundamentally, the bulk of the available generation compared to where the load is likely to be consumed requires, our ability to bring energy across long distances, as the state energy strategy has shown. We see a really high value for distributed resources as a way to distribute energy resources as a way to decrease the amount of this kind of generation and the associated transmission that are necessary. But mostly we see that value coming from energy efficiency deployment and demand response and a variety of other resources like that, right? We can reduce our overall loads and our peaks through those methods. We are less bullish on the potential for distributed generation, rooftop solar and the like, to provide those same services. Distributed generation is certainly a part of the solution, but we just don't think that it's likely to be at scales necessary to eliminate the need for new transmission or eliminate the need for large utility scale generation east of the Cascades. You know, we have over the years commissioned a number of projects that have looked at decarbonizing our electricity system and decarbonizing our electricity system plus electrification of various sectors. We had a project last year that looked at decarbonization of the Washington and Oregon transportation sector paired with a CETA compliant pathway for electricity. And in all of those studies, you know, we've analyzed the potential for including distributed generation as a kind of a component of serving the load. And what we found consistently is the models that we've kind of used have deployed no incremental distributed generation, which doesn't mean that there's no new distributed generation happening, but those policies, the CETA and the electrification policies, fundamentally don't change the economics to make distributed generation favorable, meaning that we can deploy it and it will potentially replace some utility scale generation, but it would do so at a higher incremental cost now than a utility-based approach. We don't necessarily need to, and nor do I think we should, pursue state policy that is exclusively focused on least cost strategies to decarbonization. There's a lot of other priorities, environmental and cultural and and other priorities like that need to be reconciled that may necessitate and point us in the direction of increased distributed generation as a strategy for dealing with our decarbonization priorities as a way to reduce some of those other things. But fundamentally, I think we need to recognize that trade-off, that any choice we make like that increases costs for individuals, for the economy and things like that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not a one-for-one replacement. We can't replace large-scale renewable generation for distributed generation on rooftops and things like that. That's especially the case because the higher the penetration of those resources, the lower their value, which ultimately means that the ability for us to replace the large-scale utility projects is going to be very difficult, very expensive, and maybe impossible. So I think the other thing that I sort of mentioned that I think is really important to us in this process is that it goes without saying, really valid interests beyond just climate and energy and reliability. Those are critical interests. And so being able to craft a policy and an approach that enables us to recognize all those values in developing projects on the front end is really essential. So identifying ways that utilities and project developers can know on the front end where areas of high sensitivity are is really important. Knowing what the state and various stakeholders and tribal nations and other folks require of projects in terms of impact minimization and mitigation, so that those things are factored in on the front end of the project design and the proposal rather than only at the back end after an extensive process that it is frequently historically been very long, so that we can incorporate those things on the front end and build in that communication, those expectations, and that level set on the front end is really important. And hopefully that's a way to improve outcomes while also shortening the process for approval and construction of these facilities. So I think I'll stop there. I think maybe it gradually shifted into rambling a little bit toward the end there, but hopefully that was what you all were looking for.
I did not hear any rambling going on, Vlad. So I think you're A-okay.
Oh, let me try again. No.
No, that is great. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm just checking real quick to see if Anders Bisgaard has joined us, or Joe, Lauren, have we heard anything from Anders?
I have not, and I'm not seeing him in the meeting just yet.
Okay, then I think we will be very happy that we heard from Katie and Vlad in this regard, and would invite any questions or observations from them. And by the way, both of you, Katie and Vlad, Katie, if something Vlad said kind of stimulates a thought on your behalf or on your point, please feel free to make it, and you don't have to wait for somebody to ask a question. Questions for these two? we can't let them get off the hook just because it's after lunch. Somebody's got to come up with a tough question.
So Joe's got one too.
All right.
I'll start. I hear what you're saying in terms of their concerns about the transmission system itself and the generation and the load, but we also face the realities of where the utility scale generation of renewables is most appropriate, and that all needs transmission. Any thoughts about, you talked about looking at values in terms of making sure they're represented up front. And I know there's some processes in the state that hopefully will help us get there. But also perhaps looking at, I believe I know this, that developers do look at access to available transmission when they're looking at placement of sites. Do either of you want to talk a little bit about that?
I guess what I'd say about that is that they do that, like they do that because it's available, because it's cheaper than constructing new transmission, it's faster than constructing new transmission. So, I have a pretty high confidence that that whenever possible, utilities and the developers will more or less prioritize that, because it has so many benefits compared to attempting to build a new project or relying on one being built. So that should always be the first priority. We should build renewables on brownfields. We should connect them to existing transmission where it's available and there's flat capacity. The presence of transmission, existing transmission, makes certain types of what otherwise might be not especially cost-effective renewable projects cost-effective. There's a proposal to build a fairly large solar project near where the current coal generation facility is in Centralia, and that's related to the fact that there's flat capacity and it's near load and things like that. It's almost certain that that project wouldn't have been proposed had transmission not been available there, because Western Washington is just not as good of a resource for solar. And constructing that transmission would have increased costs. So there's, that priority for using existing resources that don't require extra construction is both really important, but also I think sort of baked into the basic economics of the choices that utilities make. And so a lot of what we're solving is, I think we're charged to solve, is that's not always going to hack it and we'll need more. And so how do we build more in a way that's with high integrity, protects environmental values, that protects cultural values, and the variety of other things that we sort of identified through these conversations. I like your background, Glenn.
There you go. Kathleen, did that get your question answered? Okay, great. I'm going to go to Joe and then Rob and then Glenn.
Thanks. I was wondering if maybe Katie could talk a little bit more about the idea of matching. This has to do more with resource and load, and the idea of matching a load profile with sort of a generation profile, and how significant that could be.
Well, when I mentioned building close to load, that was with reference to that suggestion being made earlier in the call, but I wasn't saying it as a way that alluded to matching actual generation with load shapes. But if you're asking from my perspective on that, that would obviously fold into other conversations being had in the CETA implementation sphere. And I think that Joe, let me just make sure that I'm understanding your question before I ramble on about something you're not really asking.
Oh, well, I guess I'm trying to get an idea of resource quality. How much better is wind in Wyoming versus wind in Washington? And is it, I think that Nicholas maybe addressed this idea of making sure that it's really important that the resource generation profile matches the load profile. So, and this is probably more of a question for someone who is working in, renewable resource work day in and day out, but just curious.
Oh yeah, well, I think that fits with what I'm saying about keeping our minds open regionally and being aware of the fact that what we're not able to meet here in Washington at a certain time, there's potentially other places in the region that has excess that would be able to be shared, importing and exporting to balance things out. And that seems to be supported by work done in preparing the state energy strategy, and seems to be supported by a lot of the modeling being done by utilities, and that it all sort of drives the conversation toward the importance of market expansion and just being generally like aware of regional efficiencies and trying our best not to overbuild for short-term gains, and thinking longer term in terms of strategy. And yeah, that would include matching the generation to something closer to what is being needed at a certain utility in Washington.
I do think for the utilities to sort of speak to how the shapes sort of align with their load, and it might be useful for them to do so. I guess I'd sort of say two things to that question, though. One is there are some ways that the load shapes in different geographies just match utilities gaps better. So, for example, the sun rises earlier, the further east you go, and so Montana solar is potentially more likely to be generating during our morning peak than Washington solar would, right? Because the sun is already up there when it's potentially still rising here. It's sort of a rudimentary example of how that might happen. But I think the other thing that's sort of important is that the other issue is not just the shape, but also the diversity of resources. So when the wind's not blowing in the gorge at one wind turbine, it's very likely not blowing at the gorge at the next wind turbine. But there's a higher likelihood that a wind facility that's further away does have wind. And so that ability to sort of patch that variability and smooth it all together is part of the reason that diversity is necessary. If all of your variable renewables are in one place, they're all likely not generating at the same time, or they're all likely generating at the same time, both of which are of low value the rest of the time. And so having renewables in multiple places makes it more likely that maybe it's cloudy over here, but not cloudy at this solar facility, or the wind's not blowing here and it is blowing there. So I think that's part of how you sort of match it up versus just the direct load shape in any one single region versus the generation shape versus the load shape, I'm sorry. But I do think maybe if some of the IOU or COU people are on, they can and have something to contribute to Joe's question. I think they might have a useful perspective as well.
So let me just check real quick, and I do see that there are other hands with other questions patiently waiting here, but let me just check. Tom from PSC or Sarah PSC, anyone? I'm just looking to see if the Avista and Pacific Corp folks are on. Anything to add or any response to what Vlad and Katie have been saying?
So is it okay if I jump in, Nicholas?
It is totally okay if you jump in.
Okay. First of all, I 100% agree with Vlad, which is unusual for me to say. So Vlad, way to go. No, but in all seriousness, I think he really does describe the situation very well, that, when you have a much bigger region from which you can draw power, you can take the advantages of the diversity of production across the wider area. And I think that that's a real value. And I actually think that that's what markets are going to allow us to explore more efficiently. But I would also point out that there's other sorts of reliability concerns that are more related to actually, do you have enough steel in the ground to get, and this, I'm just going to go back to the example I gave, over the mountains. And if you don't, markets aren't going to fix that problem. So I think that, you know, there's great opportunities for diversity, but you still have to have the steel in the ground to get the power to the load. And I do worry, I think I made it pretty clear, I do worry about our ability to do that over the Cascade Mountain range. So with that, I will sign off.
Thanks, Nicholas. Don't sign off too far. All right, I'm going to hop over to Rob and then to Glenn, who both have questions and are in the queue. So Rob, please.
Get to my mute button. Thank you, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of a bit of a comment and a question. What we observed looking at and talking to the Power Council staff is that solar has become so inexpensive that it is displacing energy efficiency conservation measures in their portfolio. And so I hear that from the Power Council. I've worked with conservation advocates who believe that, you know, the benefits of conservation may be undervalued because, you know, they're essentially free from hydro integration concerns that are otherwise have yet to be priced with respect to renewables, and perhaps free from, you know, concerns with pygmy rabbits, sage grouse, couse, which is a root, and other things. So have you thought about what the role of energy efficiency is in these, you know, multifaceted portfolios to achieve the clean energy goals? And perhaps this is a framing question with regard to the legislation itself. I'm just not sure. So if you could help me understand that, that'd be great.
Katie or Vlad?
I mean, I can't speak to the power plan, and I have heard from conservation advocates that there's concern around, you know, what you're describing, which is the sort of reduced role of efficiency in the plan. I can't speak to that, or I'm not tracking at that level, but maybe Katie can, or other folks on the call. I do think that efficiency is sort of an essential part of the recipe. And in fact, if I don't have it in front of me, but if I recall correctly, you know, if you compare for example, in Puget's IRP, that the amount of efficiency they're planning on acquiring under the 2021 IRP compared to the pre-CETA IRPs, the amount substantially increased, right? So that kind of requirement to fully decarbonize the system really significantly increased the amount of energy efficiency that they found that utility, and likely many other utilities, found to be cost effective. And maybe one of the future folks can put some numbers to that. So I do think it's important. I think we're going to do much more of it the more we kind of push to decarbonize our system. My point is that it's not going to serve all of our energy needs. I don't think it's likely to serve all of our energy needs if we are to successfully decarbonize our economy, which doesn't make it not important. It makes it very, very important, but it also means that the work we're doing here to figure out hopefully how and where to site transmission is no less important. We will need that, in almost any future, no matter how aggressive we are in pursuing energy efficiency. I guess is how I think about it. Important, but doesn't obviate the need for this conversation and for the conversation on how and where to build utility scale assets.
And the only thing I would add is that this is something PSC or someone else could build upon, one of the utilities, because they've been working on this modeling, but CETA has protections in place that require utilities to model in a certain way that protects the value of things like energy efficiency and demand response, because it is hard to model them side by side with like something like solar and have the model choose, EE or DR. So they do make attempts to force the model to consider those on a more equal basis, in compliance with CETA, but also just with a practical mind to how these models work. And I'm sure someone else could speak to those details better than me, but just to call out that there are special attempts made to not completely diminish energy efficiency in order to reap the benefits of cheap solar.
Thanks, Katie. Rob, do you have anything you want to follow up on there? We could also see if one of the utility folks would like to speak to that. And Ian, I don't know if that's why your hand is up, if you wanted to speak to that in particular. But Rob, do you want me to ask around a little?
Susan, thank you, Susan and Katie and Vlad. Good, helpful answers. And I have to jump to another call. But if anybody has information that regarding the modeling that Katie was talking about, Ian, if that's you or anybody else, feel free to send an email to FSAC or to me if you can get my email address. I'm sure they'll pass that on. Love to talk to you about it.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks again for your presentation this morning. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, Glenn, you have been waiting for a while. Let's go to Glenn and then we'll hop over to Ian.
Thanks. This is a question for Katie. I'm interested in kind of the experience that renewable energy developers have, maybe from other parts of the country, with using like a renewable energy zone process to kind of sort through geographic areas and screen them for items of concern, and then try to identify areas that are both high value for renewable energy production, but also cause as small an impact as possible in terms of other considerations. And I've read about that, I've seen work that NREL has done on that, and Texas has a competitive renewable energy zone. And I just wondered if there was any insight from the developers of renewable projects about whether that type of approach is actually helpful, or does it just kind of create a lot of work and not necessarily any good answers.
Well, I wish Anders was here because I'm sure he'd have a great answer. Vlad, I saw you shaking your head, so you probably know more about this than me. Maybe not, I won't put you on the spot. But Glenn, I guess I'm not completely clear. I've heard this idea mentioned in other CETA conversations, and I'm not totally familiar on how that would actually work as a developer, and if it would be limiting with how they prospect sites or actually helpful. And that would be the question, which is always the question when you talk maps and how to separate these things on a map to help a developer or a utility or an agency in working through these siting processes. But yeah, I'm not honestly sure whether that would be helpful in this context or any, and if it is relevant in this region at all, to be honest.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, if any of your members have
I'll reach out
on that, that'd be great to hear about that.
Vlad, did you have anything you wanted to add? Nope. Okay, and just curious if there's anyone else, utility or otherwise, that would have any perspective on that or any familiarity with that. Happy to entertain any comments. Okay. All right, so have a note there that could be another really great piece of information to find, so we can track that as well. And Katie and Vlad, follow up with you and maybe with Anders about that. Ian, your hand is up and you have been waiting for a while. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I the conversation about, matching resources to load kind of got me thinking. I'd be really curious to hear, Vlad and Katie, what your thoughts on energy storage are and what role, or lack thereof, it might play in transmission planning and transmission siting and the congestion problems we might be facing in the future.
Who wants to take that one first? Katie?
Well, I don't really know where to begin. I think it's clear if you look at any of Renewable Northwest advocacy in basically anything that we think batteries play a very important role in this transition. We're constantly advocating for ways to better model that resource and better value, ancillary services that those resources would bring. And so, yeah, it does frustrate us when we see storage resources, I guess, seemingly limited in certain portfolio modeling exercises. But, that's all a matter of perspective. But yeah, we think that standalone storage is faring well in many parts of the country. I know there's arguments to be made about it depending on what region you're talking about. We think that hybrid resources have a lot of potential in the Northwest, and as cost projections show, it will only continue to get cheaper, and we think that it's something, while limited to a certain duration of discharge, that, like Vlad and I have been, talking, the resource diversity is important, and it's a difficult thing to work out, but how to get it accurately reflected during portfolio modeling, so that you're able to fully realize that diversity benefit. That's sort of like where our advocacy sits right now. Especially coming out of an IRP cycle and moving into a CEIP cycle here in Washington.
Katie, can you, just for those who may not know, and I would be in that group, what is a hybrid storage resource as opposed to a standalone?
Yeah, a hybrid storage resource would be paired with a clean energy resource here in Washington. So like solar typically. So solar plus storage, that's what I mean by hybrid. But you also see wind plus storage, and you sometimes see tri-hybrid wind solar storage projects as well.
Great, thank you. Vlad, did you want to jump on that question from Ian?
I agree with Katie. I think that depending on where you locate the storage, it's not just a way to shape that to match up generation and load. It's also a way to avoid transmission congestion. If it's close to load, you can get it there. Then at congested times, you don't need to bring as much power over. So there's a sort of a variety of things there. But again, sort of my basic frame on all of this stuff is that all of this helps and reduces the amount of utility scale transmission and generation and things like that needs to be constructed, but it doesn't really get it close to zero. I'm persuaded, for example, by, I think it was in 2019, that a bunch of utilities worked together to do the regional RA assessment over our 6-state footprint that looked at ELCC values for a variety of resources. And I'm not saying that those numbers are exactly right, but like philosophically, or at a high level, that the results of that research is what we find, which is that storage has decreasing value, just like solar, and especially solar in a specific location, and wind and everything else. All of these have decreasing values at higher penetrations, which doesn't mean they're not important and not a critical part of the solution, but it doesn't, again, obviate the need for a diverse renewable footprint and the transmission to bring it to load centers. And I think you could probably answer your own question better and in more detail than we can. But I think philosophically it's important, but it's not gonna take us all the way to eliminating the need for these sorts of projects in a system, a policy regime that enables them to be constructed.
Really appreciate those perspectives. Thank you.
Anything else?
I guess the only thing I'd say is that unless there are some sort of substantial, new breakthroughs in things like long duration storage and things like that, which we're not quite there yet, but the current storage that's available to utilities now. That's especially the case because we have a high storage system already, because our hydro system provides a lot of storage capacity, right? So additional storage is potentially, it is very valuable here, but potentially less valuable than it would be in other parts of the country.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in at the very end that if we're talking modeling, we're talking these things related to storage. Another of our focuses is making sure that we have the most accurate picture of loss of load events, what those actually look like, how long they are, how, you know, not just, you know, frequency, but duration of these events, and getting those right and making sure that the data informing those modeling efforts is as accurate as possible, like updating weather data and things like that, so that we're actually able to understand the need when there is a need, and what resources can fill that. But just to add that perspective, thanks.
Thanks, Kitty. Thanks, Vlad. Other questions from anyone? Looking here. All right. Well, unlike
if I could just jump in, I got an email from Anders saying he's trying to join. I don't know if he's prepared to present, but he is trying to join.
Great.
I don't know if he's sitting in the waiting room.
Don't see him there.
Okay. I don't want to derail this whole thing, but just wanted to let you know that he is attempting to come in.
Could you or would you forward that email to Lauren, and then maybe
He is
she can...
actually just admitted. He just popped into the waiting room and is here now.
This is very exciting to be waiting for him. He must love knowing that he's going to come into a room full of people.
Anders is in the house.
Oh my goodness. All right. Anders, are you with us yet? Soon. Okay. So here's what while we're waiting for Anders to come in here, I will say again, and you all should have that same mural link. If you can hop over to Mural while we are waiting, what we would be doing if we weren't waiting for Anders is I would be asking you to move over to the mural room or the mural board, and once again, try to capture those key points under those framing questions that we have up there based on the presentation you just heard. Some really interesting conversation. Again, we've had a lot of this today, which is wonderful. But if you could hop over to the mural and jot some things down while we're waiting for Anders, who looks like is here now. So I'm going to, but still do that. Still go over to the mural board, and I'm going to see if we can get Anders. Anders, I'm looking for you here. I see you on my list. What we would love to know if you are prepared at all to make any remarks about the framing questions we have regarding energy and transmission needs and opportunities for renewables. I'm not hearing you. So I would say while we're waiting.
Did you see the chat that he's unable to hear?
Lauren, could you help Anders do a little troubleshooting there? And in the meantime, we will.
We'll see what we can do.
Okay. Let us know, and Anders hopefully will let us know when he can hear us, and then we can hear him. And in the meantime, let's just take 5 minutes or so, hop over to the mural board and jot down any of those interesting observations that you have. I'll go ahead and put that link back in just in case people don't have it. And yeah, just take 5 minutes or so and jot down your thoughts. And we are chasing Anders down and actually going to send him the phone number and see if he can just call in. Poor guy, I hope he's realizing how popular he is to hear him speak. So we'll see what he has to say. let me know if you are not able to get into the mural board, then just chat in anything that you would add there, and we're very happy to add it for you. So please just take a moment and you can fill that in.
Susan, it sounds like he called in and he can now hear. So perhaps we can hear from him as well.
That's great. So I think the question would be, can he both hear and speak?
There we go. Can you hear me now? This is Anders.
We can, Anders. Awesome. This is great.
Lord, this is so I'll declare this as my victory for the day and move on.
Well, thank you for joining, and don't mean to put you on the spot. So please, if you don't feel that you're prepared for this, we were hoping as Katie and Vlad did, that you would be able to speak a little bit from your perspective on those framing questions that we had on the agenda, and very happy to put those up as well.
If you could do that again, yes, please.
Sure, you bet. Let me grab them. Hang on just a minute. I'm taking comfort in the fact that people are still putting stuff into Mural, so this is all a-okay. So here are the questions. Anders, can you see the chat?
I can see the chat.
Okay,
yes.
then I'm going to drop these questions into the chat for everybody, and if you could speak to those from your perspective, Avangrid's perspective, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, all right. So Avon Renewables, we're a large IPP with a very large presence here in the Northwest. We are a U.S. publicly traded company. We've got huge presence in Portland, Oregon. That's kind of the origins of the IPP side of the company. I'm the Senior Director for Interconnections and Transmission, so I run our U.S. interconnection and transmission function. So we sell stuff. We sell renewable power to customers. So if there's a customer out there, I can hook you up with some of our sales and origination team, and they would gladly talk to you. Utility scale, right? Interconnect to BPA, and then figure out with our customers collaboratively as to what's the right way to get that renewable power to their load. So I think that's kind of the highlight of what Avangrid Renewables is and does. The history of the company, we actually started here in the Northwest. There's a long corporate history of how we ended up where we are today, but have been here for a long time, much longer than I've been with the company. I've been with the company about 12 years now. In terms of the second one, wow, that is so deal specific. It's really hard to get into specifics, but I mean, generally speaking, in the Northwest and in Washington State, you've got nice, good renewable resources on the east side of the mountains, and then you got a bunch of load on the west side of the mountains. And so the question comes up, how do you get it from one side to the other side? And that is a challenging prospect. And I think that's probably the single biggest challenge out there, lining all of that stuff up and getting all of these different processes to work together, right? Okay, customers, whether that be customers like Puget, customers like Seattle City, C&I customers, right? Big customers like Boeing or Microsoft or Amazon, right? How do we line their procurement processes up with our interconnection process that we have to run through with BPA, right? And then the transmission process to actually get the power from our project to the customer. How do we line that process up? And then our permitting process, both at the local project and if there's a big upgrade that needs to happen, that process. And that's the magic. And it's a real challenge. So I think that's kind of the big picture. That's kind of, generally speaking, those are the areas, how we look at this. But once we get customers that have reasonable expectations and a reasonable schedule, we have historically been able to align all of those things.
Anders, could you clarify for me? I'm taking notes and others maybe as well. So I have getting procurement process lined up, and then I think you mentioned 4 things: procurement lined up with X, and then permitting process. What were those 2 mid pieces? Procurement lined up with?
It's the interconnection process,
Thank you.
and then if there's a construction schedule that goes along with that, there is a construction process that goes along with that schedule, and then lining that one up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just wanted clarification there. All right. Katie, I'm going to go back over to you. There was a question where you said, boy, if Anders were here, he could really answer that. And I'm looking back at my notes to see if I can figure out where that was. Do you recall?
That was Glenn at Department of Commerce. He had a great question about sort of like, what did he call it? Renewable energy areas or zones. Okay.
Zones, yeah.
Yeah, can you re-ask your question, Glenn, since Anders is here?
Yeah, but I'm gonna double dip. So my first question was about whether you and other developers have seen success with kind of comprehensive review of a big geographic area to screen out high priority development zones and avoid, undue impacts on various other resources that we, rather than doing it more on a piecemeal acre by acre basis. But then the bonus question that I would ask you is about whether state transmission agencies like New Mexico has, and now recently Colorado has moved ahead to create one of those, whether developers see any promise in having more of a state role in developing transmission resources.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've actually been a real world developer. I've been working the transmission interconnection side quite a bit. I think the balancing act on all these permitting groups and permitting regimes, it's just that, it's a balancing act. And we've seen some success. We've seen where other places where it's just more process. And I think that's the places where it's valuable is where it has been it hasn't been just more process on top of the existing process, right? Where it actually does streamline things and allow I'm just talking process. I'm not talking regulations or any of that stuff, just the process, right? And that, yeah, if it does that, then it's definitely a benefit. And there have been a few places around the country, and I just know they exist. Beyond that, I would be over my ski tips speaking to anything detailed on that one. As for state transmission agencies, same thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And they kind of go hand in. I think they kind of go hand in hand. Often they go hand in hand. I can't, and I'd really appreciate it if I can't touch New Mexico right now for some reasons that are going on with Avon Grid, our parent company. So there's a small potential transaction that's going through reviews that I can just. That's all I want to say about New Mexico.
All right, thank you. Glenn, anything else?
No, we're just, throwing ideas out here. So I appreciate whatever level people might have in terms of information about it.
Okay, and
Yep.
Clint, I see your hand there, but I'm going to hop over to Vlad just as the panelist to see if he wants to respond in some way.
Well, I don't have a response. I do have I do think it might be, so these sort of zones may not be helpful to developers, but they may be helpful to other interests. And so it would, in addition to asking that question of Anders or other folks within that sort of constituency, it'd be helpful to know if conservation advocates or tribal, there's other stakeholders. So it's possible to have a system that doesn't necessarily solve all the siting issues related to, let's say, transmission from the developer perspective, but does help solve a set of farmland preservation or habitat protection or cultural resource issues. And so, I think Clickatat, right, has such a policy, so it might be helpful to hear. I'm not trying to create agendas for you all, but but I do think it might be helpful to hear from places that have this, how it's worked for them, because it may serve other needs, even if it doesn't fully address the need on the developer side. And that's also very valid and important to incorporate. I guess that add that question to Glenn's maybe for a future meeting, I guess.
Definitely. Thank you. Appreciate that. Clint.
Anders and maybe Katie or Vlad can chime in. My question is let's skip from the difficulties on siting, and now you got a site up and running, a renewable site up and running. Nicholas shared this morning a partial map of generation sites in Western Washington, a lot of natural gas facilities. And my question is as we get down the road on 20 CETA, and these plants need to be neutral, how do we get to the point where we can have a base load that can shape some of these intermittent resources and have a viable product for utilities to be able to purchase? I understand you said you could put contracts together now, or understood it that way, but where's that baseload shaping going to come from? And diversity is great, and I know we need that. That will help. But where's the baseload going to come from in the post 2030 timeframe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a little bit above my pay grade, but I do think that there are. We've got a gen-only BA right now, and that's one of the things Avon Grid has, and our ability to balance our own generation is one of those. And there's a lot of technologies out there getting at that. I think batteries are part of it, that's one of the big challenges for our business right now is how do we do that, right? It's the worst, in Anders' opinion, and to a certain extent Avon Grid's opinion. You gotta stay reliable, right? That's gonna do all sorts of negative things all over the place if you get into an unreliable scenario, and so we got to figure that one out. I don't think we're there in the near term here, but I'm also not a utility. I think their utilities could speak to that one a lot better than I could, Clint. But I think that reliability and is what I think you're getting at there, and what happens afterwards is a key thing, and that's a big challenge that we're going to have to figure out. I don't have a good strategy right now. Diversity, geographic diversity is part of that, absolutely. I think batteries are part of that. Utility scale batteries are part of that. I think those are two of the big parts, but I think there are, I don't know what other options there are out there. That is a challenge. And I think that is the one thing we all got to think about in this is that just reliability. We got to keep this reliable. You can't have people buying into, can't expect people to buy into stuff if we don't have a reliable energy supply.
Thank you.
Thanks. Clint, anything else?
I guess I don't.
Oh.
I was just going to say, I guess I don't think about if I baseload, you mean sort of a traditional like baseload generation, the large thermal plant that never turns off. Like, I don't think that's we have challenges on our long-term challenges on resource planning and resource deployment, but I don't think that's the thing that we need. What we need is not the base upon which you build an additional generation, but the other side of it. You need dispatchable resource. Yeah, right. But it's not what people traditionally. That's not what we need. Is not to do, and not that doesn't contribute or help manage the system, having those large, always on resources. In fact, Washington or the Northwest does have some of that and will continue to have some of that. Hydro contributes somewhat to that. We have a nuclear facility, which, you know, is a traditional baseload, facility. But the thing that the Northwest needs is the flexible resource that can be turned on to fill in gaps and serve peaks versus the kind of traditional mode of thinking about baseload, which again is the large thermal, high capacity factor resource. So that is the utility sector nationally and in Washington really is looking toward gas plants, sort of often by default, which we discourage, and obviously we think CETA is intended to reduce and get away from over time. Modeling, again, Commerce's modeling as well as other modeling shows that those kind of highly flexible dispatchable resources end up having pretty small capacity factors because their role is that shaping and filling in gaps versus, you know, large energy service. And that's the way I think we're going to be thinking about that. I also think it's just really important to note that the 2030 target is an 80% target, more or less in both Washington and Oregon, right? So it retains a decent amount of space for, you know, unrestricted, highly dispatchable and emitting resources for a long time, which doesn't mean we don't have RA needs and reliability needs and need to construct a bunch of resources, but we are far away from a future. In fact, I don't think CETA ever calls for a future that eliminates the presence of those resources.
I guess the only clarification I would add on, and then I want to turn this back to the moderator, is not just utilities don't need just resources that will fill in for little periods of time. We need a block resource. The only way we can purchase as a load following customers, we need a block resource, not something that is going to be variable through the day. And so it's not just an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour energy storage that's going to shape this. It needs to truly be a block. Thanks for the comments on that.
Thanks, Clint. Appreciate that. I'm going to hop over to Dana, and then Nicholas, I'll come over to you.
Yeah, I have a question or two. In regards to a developer, how far in advance would your company know on where you're going to build your infrastructure? And then the accommodation wants avoidance to cultural resources, sacred sites, and native foods. What would your company do to protect these sites?
Yeah, I think that I'm not a permitting guy or gal. I am pretty happy that we've identify and work on that stuff as soon as we can. It's one of the early screens, Dana, that we have against projects. And when we go out and take a look at a project, is we try to go out there and find those sites to avoid them. What the mitigations are, we then go out and engage with the local community and try to sort those out. Sometimes more often than not, we're able to get to a good spot. Sometimes you can't get there, and you just have to figure out what's the right way from there forward. But we identify that as soon as we possibly can. And I mean, we're sinking a lot of money into this stuff, so we would want to find them earlier rather than later. And identify them and figure out the problem, figure out how to mitigate, or how we can work with the communities to address their concerns.
So would that be a year, 2 years?
Man, I got to admit, I mean, I can come up with both ends of the spectrum, depending on where we are. Some parts of the country, it's easier than other parts of the country. Here in the Northwest, we try to identify them pretty early. The permitting processes are there. The county or state level permitting processes are very, very thorough in Oregon and Washington. So we work our way through those on the schedule that they allow us. I mean, the permitting process is always at least a year long. Prior to that, I don't usually get terribly involved in them that early on.
Okay, so over here on this side of the mountain range, Yakima Nation has a large area of land base. So no matter which way you go, you're going to impact some type of Yakima Nation site.
Yeah, I if there's something specific, a specific project or a specific area, I can't talk to that just because I'm not knowledgeable and I'm not super connected into that area. But if more than willing to set you up and have you chat with some folks here if you'd like to. But when it comes to long-term, I mean, are you thinking more transmission lines, long transmission lines, or the project side?
Any type of energy project, solar project,
right?
Transmission line, wind farms.
Yeah.
And Dana, is part of the interest there wanting to know as early as possible, as soon as possible? Is that what you're?
Yes.
Is that what you're?
As soon as possible.
Okay.
That's your best bet.
Okay.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Dana. Appreciate that. Nicholas and then Stephen.
I'm trying to start my video.
There you go.
I'm sorry about that. So I might be plowing ground that's already been thoroughly disturbed, but one of the things I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of reliability that is utilities look at it in two distinct ways and more than that, but at least two distinct ways. And the solutions are different depending upon the reliability issue that you're dealing with. If you think about what happened in Texas or California, in both instances, they had a situation where they could not deliver electricity because the generating capacity was not available. In Texas, it was because they hadn't done some reinforcement mechanisms to their generators. And in my understanding in California, they simply have run out of power. And some of that's due to policy decisions, some of that's due to economic considerations. In my mind, at least, the obvious solution there is to spend money to either reinforce the steel in the ground that you have, or it is to, put more steel in the ground. But the other kind of issue is more of the reliability issue that Vlad was talking about, where you need a ramping capability. You need to be able to bring resources that are only going to be used a little bit of the time, but are going to be used to help you deal with changes in load that happen quickly. Or you need to fill in a gap because a resource broke and you have to have another one available to take its place. And for that, utilities are doing a good job today of working together. There's something called the Northwest Powerful Resource Sufficiency Project. And it's many utilities have gotten together and they basically back each other up in order to make sure that those sorts of events don't result in a problem where a utility can't meet load. And also it allows you to, by sharing excess resources, it allows you to avoid having too much of them, and it actually saves customers money. So, for that type of concern, there are mechanisms in place, and they're being expanded upon and enhanced. And I just want people to know that those sorts of activities are ongoing today. The former, the one I described first, is in some ways the more challenging because you end up with a situation that's pretty rare, but the consequences of losing power in the middle of a cold snap or a heat wave can be pretty severe, including up to people, not being able to use their medical equipment or other things and suffering, pretty significant, including death type of consequences. So, utilities are looking at both of these very carefully. the one I think we're moving farther down this path to a solution than the other. But thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Stephen, your hand is up, and then I think we will take a final comment about mural or invite people to go to mural, and then we're going to take a break. So I think you will have the last question or comment here for this panel.
Oh, thank you very much, Susan. And then after this, I'm going to have to go because I have to get my daughter from school.
Understood.
So I just want to touch on a couple quick things. One, I want to just add to some of the comments that Dana made a few minutes ago. When it comes to cultural resources, and I've been involved in cultural resource protection since 2005 for the Snoqualmie tribe. One thing that I often try to get people to understand, cultural resources, besides being completely unrenewable, our level of concern is based off of, from my perspective, three main things. There's the location of the work is the most important thing, whether we're talking about transmission lines that stretch hundreds of miles, or we're talking about power stations that are on like a quarter of an acre. It doesn't matter where it is. It matters where it is for the initial concern. Then the scope of work is the next most important thing. So obviously, if you're doing work in a previously disturbed utility line, there's going to be different probabilities based on when that work was originally done. As a practical way of thinking about it, any utility, any construction, anything that was done really before 1990 probably didn't have really good, if at all, cultural resource review done. So even if it's heavily disturbed, most tribes that I work with, and the Snoqualmie for sure, are going to have cultural concerns. Then, of course, the last thing that we look at is really permitting and funding, because that determines what set of laws and policies that you look at. So I just want to just sort of recap: location, scope of work, funding, and permitting are always the three main things that we look at. I don't care what anyone is doing. I also want to add, I and my staff review over 4,000 development projects a year, so about 400 a week. So we're very, very familiar with reviewing projects of all types, whether it's with a SEPA, going through the state environmental policy checklist, or whether it's, a large proposal for a construction of a ferry terminal or anything. We look at lots of different things. And with the recent modification to the Executive Order 0505 being replaced by 2102, that does put a lot of burden on everyone who reviews projects and permits, especially tribes. But in general, anyone that works in cultural resources is understaffed, underfunded. So we want to make sure that we respond to everything that we have concerns with, but also we want to build relationships with the people that are doing the projects, because we want to be able to have a project go forward without any perception of tribes are trying to stop something from happening, which is very rarely the case, at least from a cultural resources perspective. There's a lot of limitations to what we can ask. And then the last thing that I wanted to add is more of a general comment on this overall conversation that we're having, and I haven't heard it talked about too much, but so I just want to put it out there. You understand we're talking about essentially the large power and transmission infrastructure for Washington. But I do think that everyone involved in power, whether it's generation, installation, construction, maintenance, there really should be a focus on having homeowners and property managers actually take some responsibility and encourage them to use renewable resources like solar panels, potential local wind turbines when possible, to help sort of mitigate the reliance on the grid, especially in the case of there's being some sort of failure, some sort of power outage. Instead of people being flat out without power, we should encourage them to actually be able to take care of their own power needs if they need be. I know that's somewhat of a controversial topic. I know, especially people always say that you can't use solar in Western Washington. It's too clouds. That's not true. One of my coworkers, that's his specialty. He actually has a master's degree in sustainable community development, and he has done lots of work in many areas with clouds. So it takes some fundamental changes in how we look at things, but ultimately our reliance on things should not be on the big power companies. They are part of the solution, but they're not the only solution. And quite frankly, we need their help to make sure that we have in as many ways to have access to power as possible, even if it's not through those companies. And I know that that's not popular. It's not a popular opinion. I work with power companies all the time. I mentioned that to them. So that being said, thank you all very much for your time. I apologize that I need to duck out, but as productive and interesting all this is, my daughter is more important.
Understood. And thank you for your comments, Stephen. I got lots of great notes and really thinking about the planning and the implementation piece and the importance of having adequate time to do the on the ground work and the reviews. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Really appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead, Kathleen. I'm going to suggest that we take a 15-minute break, and I'm going to continue to ask people that if they have a minute, just to drop in some observations, some things you're thinking about into our mural board. We are, when we get back from break, going to have a discussion that really tries to knit all this together. We've had some really rich discussion around each of these pieces, and now we're going to be looking at where is there some connection here? Where are there some overarching themes? What are we hearing that either might be converging things or things that maybe, you know, you heard from speakers that may need to be puzzled out a little bit. So we're going to be looking for those big picture conversations when we get back. But if that works for you, Kathleen, we'll take 15. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, so 15 minutes, be back. And then for those that are live streaming, we will have information about, to remind you again about how you can get in to make a public comment if you would like to do so. So we'll get that going so that you have that information. And then other folks, please take a break and we'll see you in 15. Thank you. Okay, if we can start to get people thinking about coming back together, got a minute or so left of your break, but if you can start to get settled in, then we will get started here virtually any minute. If you can turn your videos on just so that we can see that you are here, or give me a thumbs up through the digital thumbs up, just again, so that we know that you're here, that would be great. Just taking a look here. Also, just want to mention, and I tend to not call on quiet people just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to weigh in, but I really do invite you, especially if you have been a little bit quieter, please let me know if you don't feel that you have space to jump into the conversation. I'm very happy to make some real deliberate space for you. I just want to be sure that everyone feels welcome to jump in, feels comfortable doing that. That would be great. So please let me know. You can chat me privately if you've been wanting to say something and you just don't feel like you've got space to do it. Happy to do that. And also just know that I'm inviting you because we are getting into a very conversational part of the meeting, which we've had some great conversation, but this will really be very open to thinking about all of the presentations we've had and maybe some threads that you are finding with that. So hopefully everyone will feel enabled to participate. So let's go ahead, Rob, if you could advance us to the next slide. Oh, pardon me, I didn't have my ears in. Could you even hear me?
Yeah, we heard you just fine.
Yeah, we could hear you.
Okay, wow. That must be amazing. I left that out. Okay, so let's go ahead. We're going to group discussion, impressions and reflections. We have some on the agenda, just again, some prompting questions that we were going to invite you to speak to. What are the high-level observations and takeaways from today's presentations? What's the range of energy needs and opportunities that may have emerged for you as you were listening to those conversations? Were there some obvious gaps in energy sources that you would want to note, having heard those presentations? And during that conversation, there were numerous times that people were speaking about either concerns for or ways to maybe plan for, to prevent potential adverse impacts, certainly to cultural and natural resources. But if you have some thoughts about that, about potential impacts and some of the things you heard from the presentation. Rob Willis, who facilitated the first meeting from the Ross team, is going to capture notes on screen here while you're speaking. So not to transcribe everything you're saying, but he's going to try to capture, again, those high level takeaways, those connective pieces that you identify from the conversations. So want to provide an opportunity for that. Let me just take a moment again to say, those of you who are on the live stream, if you want to make a public comment, we had up for some time, we had the link that you would need to use in order to jump into the Zoom meeting. So if hopefully you have that, and at 3:50 you will be able to join the meeting. So with that, I'm going to quit talking and look for people who have their hands raised, who might be interested in commenting some high-level thoughts and observations from those presentations we've had. And if we've had too many presentations for you to remember, feel free to jump back to the mural board and see those insightful things that you captured earlier to help remind you. Thoughts? Lauren has dropped the link in again to the mural board if you want to take a look at what people have noted there and possibly comment just based on that as well. That might be a good way to provoke your thinking.
I guess, I can start off with a couple of my thoughts from today, which was just a very rich conversation and discussion, certainly starting with Rob's presentation on Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and just really remembering that our frame, even though what we want to do is solve what happens in Washington, that our frame is bigger, and that the impacts of the regional situation as well as US and Canada do impact what we can do within the state. I think that has been a lot of support for looking at distributed energy and other ways to achieve some of the Washington strategy goals, but a recognition at the same time that that's not going to be enough to meet the goals for the future, including the electrification, which is in that plan as well. And I guess that's another point that came home to me, is that we're not trying to reinvent what the goal is through our process here. I think what we're trying to do is determine what are the ways for us to achieve those goals and the options to link generation to load that we know will exist in the future and are recommended in the strategy. So, really trying to keep the focus on that transmission piece.
Thanks, Kathleen. Other observations?
I've got one comment. I think this is maybe a given for most folks at this point, but I think it's pretty clear that most of the resource is on the east side of the Cascades, but most of the load that we are trying to serve is located on the west side.
Yeah, this is Stuart, sort of building on that, of the stuff that seems fairly clear. I think it's also, I'm just hearing a real broad agreement that, conservation and distributed resources and anything that can reduce the need to transmit, like it's way better to save energy than to generate it and transmit it and do all that. As Kathleen said, our belief is we could do a ton of conservation and we're still going to need to do transmission if our predictions are correct. And as Kathleen said, we're not here to reconsider that. But I'm really hearing, I think, in addition to figuring out, understanding what the transmission that we still need to do needs to look like, I think it's very fair for us to say we ought to really be working on the conservation and efficiency side.
Thanks, Stu. What else did you hear? And by the way, other things that you can identify here, it doesn't necessarily have to be where you think there might have been some agreement. If you heard something that surprised you, that would be a great thing to surface for others and see if others share your surprise.
I can share a surprise. It's like I never hear anyone. We're talking about the energy is on. The cheapest energy is on the east side, and the need is on the west side. And like I never hear anybody say, from the east side, hey, you should grow your own apples in Seattle. We're not going to sell you any apples, or grow your own wine or whatever. And I know there's farmers who are really happy to have renewable energy sited on their farms, whether it's wind or solar, because it helps them stay in business. And it's just interesting how what's different about this as a resource that that farm, that people can be selling to the west side.
Mhm. Other threads, other observations? I'm looking at the mural board. There are some really interesting things that that people have noted here. That notion that the opportunities to minimize impacts through better use of existing facilities. I think a number of speakers mentioned something about that, the opportunities to upgrade and how that can be useful. So that at least is something that has been in the conversation, looking at the mural board.
This is Joe. I think the idea of that transmission planning, especially reliability planning, needs to be done. What was my thought there? Sorry, I lost my thought there. It'll come back to me.
I believe it will. Elizabeth.
Hi, this is Elizabeth from UDC. So thank you for a great conversation, great panelists this morning and this afternoon. I guess I just wanted to bring up and highlight the several variables that we have to address. Is not only about generation resources, it's also about opportunities that there are new for the system overall. We're talking about demand response. We're talking about other things that, quite frankly, in the past were not part of the puzzle that we have to solve at this point. So, and the importance of things like the environmental impacts and other equity components that we have to take into account that make this, quite frankly, a very complex exercise. I think, in my view, I would like to see kind of like a higher level perspective, in the sense of, let's try to identify where we have resources, where we have opportunities, what are the things that we kind of need to elevate or we need to take into account in order for us to provide some holistic recommendations that take into account not only the impacts and the realities of what is going to be operating this new system that we honestly don't know what it's going to be like in the end, but try to capture all of those variables in terms of the service providers, in terms of the transmission facilities needed to take that load to the customer, what the customer will be able to do, the things that customers are going to be actually doing, because they're going to have different patterns, different behaviors, and different interactions with the system. So it's a big conversation, and sometimes quite frankly, it's overwhelming for me. But I think we're making good progress in identifying certain things that we need to account for to get there.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And as Rob is capturing notes here, if we capture something and we didn't get something quite the way that you meant it, please don't hesitate to say, actually, it was this other thing. That would be good. So thanks, Elizabeth, for that. Joe, did you remember? I see your hand up.
I'm muted, sorry. What I was trying to say is that transmission planning and specifically reliability planning should take into account the idea of these load extremes, as Nicholas was pointing out. So, you know, we're planning for not the average day, but, you know, the coldest day of the year or the hottest week of the year.
Peaks.
Peaks.
I have a question about that. Did anyone else hear Rob in his presentation, or I think he was asking a question about that, or saying something saying that it sounded like maybe he had some concern, and he's not here to respond, but he identified some concern about maybe putting so much focus on resources that are only solving something that happens very infrequently, and that maybe there are some disproportionate impacts that might be encountered by doing that. I'd be interested to know if other people heard that or how you would respond to that. And I'm not advocating anything here, just he's mentioned that, and I was hearing some other things from other people. So I'd be interested to know if anyone has a thought about that.
So Nicholas here, perhaps I could take a shot.
Sure.
I think it's largely an accurate statement. You know, the peak load occurs over a pretty short period of time. Typically, as I understand it, in the Pacific Northwest, we have cold snaps that last 3 to 7 days. And, you know, the recent heat dome lasted 3-4 days, something along those lines. So it's not like, at least I would not anticipate the peak needs are going to be, you know, on the order of minutes. But I do think that they'll probably be on the order of, you know, tens to hundreds of hours, you know, 10 to 100 hours. But that said, you know, if you have a situation where it's 105 out and you have no air conditioning, that could be a problem physically. Or if you know, have some sort of compromised situation and you need medical equipment and it's not running, that could be a significant problem. And the same is true when it's incredibly cold out, when it's, you know, at least in the Pacific Northwest, incredibly cold is, you know, in the teens. And if you're not prepared for that, that could be also a significant and adverse outcome. So while I think it's true that, you know, in many instances, we're talking about a short period of time. We're talking about a time when it's probably, in my opinion, even more important that we are able to actually provide the service, because if you don't, you know, I'm trying not to be hyperbolic, but, you know, I think people will die, and we want to avoid that. So, you know, I think it's an accurate statement, but I don't think that it diminishes the importance of it.
Perhaps I did hear Rob say that, and I did hear him saying, so if we're planning for that, that might be that much more cost, not just cost in terms of money, but cost to, you know, the salmon, cost to the environment, cost to cultural resources, cost to us as a society. More what comes to mind, and I hear what Nicholas is saying, but what comes to mind to me is more along the lines of what Elizabeth perhaps was raising, is, are there other ways not to deny people power, during those times. But are there other ways to perhaps shift load so the most vulnerable people who really need it get it? I mean, are there alternative ways to meet that load besides how we historically have planned over the last 50 years? That's the question to me.
Yeah, Kathleen, I totally agree with what you just said, and that's exactly where I was going. I think not only the system, customers are going to have different behaviors and different opportunities to make a difference in those moments. And it's been, Texas, what happened in Texas earlier this year showed us that their populations that are specifically vulnerable to this type of events are going to pay the highest costs. That's the bottom line. So what can we do that is not just overbuilding, overexpending? What other alternatives are there? What kind of technologies do we have to address that problem that are cost efficient, that are environmentally friendly, that are, and this is an open-ended question. I'm not pointing exactly at one particular technology or another. I'm not endorsing anything at this point. I'm just saying those are things that we should be able to explore, and that's where the importance of pointing out specifically what that the system, this is what sometimes it's a little bit, it's difficult having this discussion. It's because sometimes we see the system as a one-sided entity, that it's just companies just producing energy and just sending it to customers. And that was probably true 50 years ago. But right now we're heading to a different future with different capabilities and with different consumption patterns. So yeah, I think it's very valuable to identify where we can have serious and very real opportunities to solve those problems in a cost-efficient way.
All right, thank you both. Okay, what else is out there to talk about? Pardon me.
So if I could just respond, because I completely agree with what Elizabeth said. I mean, we want to look for the least cost, most effective solutions out there. And if there are technologies that will allow us to achieve that without having to, build massive amounts of new transmission, I think that would be an outstanding result. But realize that we're talking about very, very large quantities of power that are going to be needed for a very short period of time. And there is an absolute concern on my part, at least, that about the equity implications, because, be frank, I can afford a generator. And so if the power goes out when it gets really cold, I go outside and start my generator. But not everyone can do that. There are a lot of people who don't have those sorts of options.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think that there are other options potentially available. We really have to think about whether or not they're truly available and how effective they're going to be. But thank you.
Great, thank you. All right. What are other themes, other things? And you can continue on this theme or this conversation, certainly, if you would like to jump in on that. But are there other things that you heard that were either key takeaways for you or surprised you, or seemed like there's a thread that was flowing from one conversation to another in the presentations that we had today? Again, I'm looking at the mural board too.
Glenn's got his hand up.
Oh, pardon me, missed that. Glenn.
First, I want to say that I would really love to hear from other members of the working group. I'm sensitive to the fact that a lot of times it's me stepping up to to offer comments on this. we're getting FSEG staff making comments as well. When I would really like to hear from the working group members on this, in this discussion, so that we can develop this report together. And so having said that, I will still offer a comment, and that is that I really hope we'll focus on this question of the barriers to transmission. It can be awfully easy to deflect a bit and say, well, but what can we do to avoid the need for transmission? And like Nicholas was saying, I mean, we should certainly grab those opportunities where they exist. But our charge from the legislature is to look at the barriers to transmission and see if we can come up with some things to reduce those barriers. And so I would rather us dig in on those specific questions to the extent we possibly can. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. And appreciate the reminder and the invitation to hear from other work group members. I'm thinking we would certainly benefit from hearing there are other state departments that are here. There are cities that are here. Always value hearing from folks associated with tribes. And so please, if you have some perspective to share, things that you took away from these conversations, would love to hear from you. Got some county folks here. Be interested to know, what some of your takeaways were from these conversations.
Susan, this is Rob. Perhaps while there's a pause in the conversation, I can let folks know that, excuse me, what you're experiencing is an old facilitator's trick here. What Susan and I are trying to do in this session is to begin doing the work for meeting 3. What we're going to be doing in meeting 3 is moving from collective learning, shared learning, which we've been doing on this meeting, hearing from one another, to trying to come up with shared meaning. So we're going from shared learning to shared meaning. And part of that process is beginning to think through what through lines are folks seeing? Where are the areas of convergence? Where are the areas of divergence? Particularly as it pertains to what our core focus is. So the more work that we can do today, and just getting your thoughts down on paper. Where did you see areas of convergence? Where do you see areas of divergence? What are surprises? What are the through lines that you're it's going to enable us to have a more effective meeting number 3. Because that's what we're going to be doing between now and then, is we're going to be going through the meeting notes, we're going to be going through the presentations, we're going to go through the mural, so that we can tee up the very specific conversations we think we need to have. And it sounds like there's a wonderful conversation around equity considerations in the transmission system. That's something that wasn't on our radar screen as explicitly as it was 25 minutes ago. So I'm just imploring folks from the Transmission Corridors Work Group to help me fill out these 2 or 3 or 4 slides with just things that you're seeing. That's the end of my TED Talk.
Thank you, Rob. All right, Lindsay, your hand is up.
So one of the things I think I found surprising was a lack of focus on distributed generation versus focusing on transmission. And I realize, yes, this is transmission corridors, but overlooking moving some of our energy generation capacity closer to our load requirements, I think should be a major part of the discussion.
Okay, appreciate that. Other thoughts? And Elizabeth, I'm guessing your hand, you just haven't put your hand down yet, or is it up again? Ah, okay.
I had a thought. Susan.
Oh, yes,
thinking about
please.
what Nicholas said and considerations around those who are most vulnerable to disruptions and what we know about them. So I'm just curious where that data lives or where it should live and what should be collected and what what FSEC has or has identified as a gap, because naming vulnerabilities and the tools where anticipation of harms being disproportionately distributed to particular communities, particular places that are more susceptible to weather events and climate-related hazards and other kind of forms of potential hazard or opportunity related to transmission corridor build out or reimagining or whatever, is I think an important exercise. And I don't know, we didn't hear so much about it today, but there was some there were points raised about considering communities, particularly in tribal lands, and food sources as impacted by generation corridor links. So what data is missing, or what tool is missing, or what mechanism is missing to really zone in on the harm of sort of like what happens if we do nothing, and what happens if we do this, and what happens if we do that, but the harm to people, and not like the harm beyond, oh no power, which is significant, and life or death as noted, but just thinking more broadly about the impacts on humanity, on culture, on functionality, and like functionality beyond just a functional economy as we know it now, or has been accepted as like to what we can imagine as more, I guess, more substantively self-sufficient, without so many uncertainty kind of variables floating around that have to be decided in small, pretty technocratic groups, as opposed to a more democratic process with more public information. So that's sort of what was discussed. I don't know if there were points of consensus. Also, it was also what wasn't discussed, but I think was present. And yeah, it could be coming up with a framework for of identifying specific types of vulnerabilities, and specific actions that utility actors and kind of development space entities and kind of regulatory entities and local governance and other involved stakeholders have to adopt to an anticipation of needing to provide protections in light of the potential harms to those communities or to those populations.
Thank you, Mariel. That's really helpful, and it does sound, in listening to you, and then also listening to Glenn and others, is it really does seem like it's, and Nicholas, there's a couple different pieces to it. It's the potential harm to those communities, those people, those populations from not having access to the energy that they need, as well as potential harms depending on the location of the facilities and how all of that works. So there's lots of different ways to come at this, and that's what I'm hearing from your description. Thank you for that. Other thoughts, other things you heard or didn't hear, would like to hear more of, or think that we're going to need to be really factoring in to get to that conversation that's going to be coming up that Rob was referencing a moment ago. Again, looking for those voices that have been a little quieter. Dana?
Yeah, I think the early consultation with the tribal nations needs to be more proactive. It was brought up, but very little attention was given to it. Because the tribal nations always are impacted in some way or another with these energy projects. The old transmission lines were built prior to the cultural resource protection law, and then that had no study done, and then the resources were impacted or destroyed. So there needs to be that early Section 106 process done within the NEPA or SEPA. And then maybe focusing on improving the existing transmission lines before the new projects are presented or planned out. That way the study is more accurately performed toward the cultural and natural resources that'll give the tribal nations a better outlook on the projects.
Thanks, Dana. That's very helpful. Question for you. There's the consultation, the formal government to government consultation that needs to occur. And what I'm hearing from you is that early and often would be very helpful. Are there other ways that you would want to see tribes involved in these conversations that would be something other than the formal government to government piece that you think would help address some of the issues that have been raised today around trying to be mindful of sensitive areas in thinking about either upgrading existing facilities if they're getting built up bigger or something new? Do you have thoughts about that?
First, it would be staff level regarding the consultation. It begins there. The companies that have the projects have to engage with the staff. They work it out between themselves, and then once they near the final project, then that becomes the government to government consultation.
Thanks, that's helpful. Anything else right now, Dana?
No, I believe I'm done.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay, Clint and then Steve, you have your hands up.
Susan, this might have been said earlier. I missed the first couple pages there. And it's similar to what Nicholas talked about with the economics of construction. But I would say standardization of transmission lines and standardization of transmission voltages. We've got lines running east-west, everybody keeps focusing on, but they're not all 500 kV. They're not all 500 kV. Maybe we need to standardize on a voltage or convert some of them.
And sure. And can I just follow up and ask, can you say a little bit more about what that would address for you, how that would, the solution that is?
The solution is the higher the voltage, the more capacity you get out
Gotcha.
of a transmission line.
Okay. Thank you. All right, Steve.
Hey, good afternoon. I think I got the hint pretty clearly. Federal agencies chime on in, so I wanted to go ahead and chime in, but I've been enjoying a lot of the dialogue, and we touched on this issue, so it's more of an observation, and I just wanted to broach the question here as part of this phase of the understanding, as it was eloquently captured earlier. And it's in regards to the low-hanging fruit, specifically related to having a better understanding what is our current baseline. And I know in our first meeting when baseline of available capacity was raised, and I think Kathleen may have addressed that in saying that they, part of what this group is chartered to do is not to go into perhaps that level of detail, but the observation I wanted to share with the team on the line here is that many of the points that have been raised, whether it's low-hanging fruit, whether it is equity or social equity issue, it would be very helpful as part of this effort to at least put in place and have an understanding of what is that baseline of where are the low-hanging fruit based on capacity. Certain lines, they may be there, but they may be already at capacity. So really not likely for potential low-hanging fruit there. But that will also help, I believe, as it has in similar initiatives, as we look at other points that have been raised by a few of the other colleagues on today's call and on our first call, which is as we start looking at growth, well, if we had an understanding of what that baseline was, at least at the wave top level, we can then set the stage of what the next level of drill down may be to address the barriers items that this group would be looking at, maybe in the later phases of this current effort, or maybe it's a subsequent new effort. But as I listened to just this robust discussion from the first session and today's session, many of the points that have been raised by many of the colleagues on the line really would lend to and be helpful to have at least a baseline understanding of where some of those gaps would be, where are the capacity, what's the available capacity in certain areas. And again, not a drill down, but I do think having something of that nature for a baseline would help facilitate that next session that we will have, the next working group session. So that's our 2 cents from DoD. Back to you. Over.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. And I'm thinking of the information as you referenced the first session and this session, and thinking that there's probably an opportunity as we're preparing for the next meeting is just to pull some of that information we've heard together. So synthesize it so that it's easy for the committee or the work group to get their hands on and really think about that. So appreciate you daylighting that for us.
Yeah, and if I could just add on that, as
sure.
If that's something that the team will entertain in preparing for the group to look at to facilitate our next discussion, the only suggestion I would make here is, and again, I share this with you from a knuckle dragger perspective. So simple and pictures are always a plus in bubble diagrams. That's the level of wave top that I'm sharing here, at least so the team members on the call have a visual and can actually see where some of those baseline gaps or capacity availability or non-availabilities may exist. So again, okay, that was 2.5 cents. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. And let me just take a moment here. I know I have a couple more hands. I've been pretty focused on the discussion and didn't see on the chat that there have been some conversations about wanting to be able to see the other things that are on this, the other notes that Rob has taken. So we'll definitely get those sent out right away. They are in a slide deck right now, so he would literally have to click back to different slides in order to do this. We'll look for another way maybe to do this next time, so we can absolutely screenshot that. But there have been some affirmations of things that people are saying, etc. So I invite you to follow along in the chat as well. Appreciate people dropping that in. Mario, your hand is up. I don't know if it's still up or if it's up anew. So just wanted to check with you.
Yes, but I think Anders was up before.
Okay. Anders or Anders? I'm not sure which way it is. I keep saying Anders, but I'm from Nebraska. So that just might be the way I say things. So yes, Anders. If you are, well, you are unmuted. So maybe you had to step away for a minute. Mario, I think you can go ahead. I think Anders might be stepped away from his microphone.
Okay. I think I just had a reaction to what Steve shared, and I agree. A little more information about the numbers. About feeling like once you put the numbers out there, we have to really glomp onto them. But that helps. I think we have a more kind of a higher level understanding of what we're working with, or the sense of what information is there around baselines. I think that is related to just good transparency that will be not only helpful for the group as we talk and try to use have some similar frame of reference for the scale of this, and also just some similar vocabulary and visual presentations, maps, simple graphs are much appreciated. I also just think the principles around transparency and having evidence-based, data-driven frameworks of understanding. And I think there can be, there's a place for, I think, drilling down into general principles of working together as an advisory group. So that will, I think, be reflected in the next, hopefully reflected in the next iteration of the charter. One thing that I thought was also, I sensed it's missing, but I had to step out for a bit of this meeting and didn't join the first one. So I might be mistaken, but any kind of discussion or considerations around costs, not just actual dollar amounts that I didn't hear come up today at all, but more around costs and economic considerations, including social, economic, and workforce related to transmission, build out, and certain decisions around working on existing infrastructure and reinforcing versus building out new infrastructure. And on the workforce side, what does this mean? Maybe Commerce has or has already shared some reflections on what are the implications of transmission, not just innovation tech side, and what is possible in the world of the future. But who's going to build this? Are they local? Are they unionized? Is there some idea of security and engagement in building out this clean energy infrastructure, workforce security and opportunity, because there are a lot of implications on how people are impacted, Washingtonians and maybe non-Washingtonians, insofar as non-residents are brought into this or are relied upon for build out in some of the out of state generation and transmission. But if those considerations aren't at least touched on by folks who have some numbers and have some insights, and I don't know if that would be labor side too, in terms of agencies, then I feel like that's an important part of the equity picture and the overall picture of important considerations around the opportunities for facilitating kind of clean energy movement in Washington. Yeah, so especially that workforce labor point.
Great, thank you. I am capturing notes as well as Rob has those up as well. So thanks for that, Mario, appreciate it. Looking to see, it looks like if Anders had a hand up, he took it down, or actually looks like maybe he had to hop out. So
he actually he's got some information in the chat and had a comment that it didn't look like people could hear him.
That is
so his
true.
comment in the chat is that BPA standardized on 500 kilovolts for its main grid backbone in the 1960s for long distance bulk power transfers. However, there were several lines across the Cascades constructed at 345 kilovolts or lower before 500 kV was available. Rebuilding those lines to 500 kV would require a modest increase in right-of-way width, but could be a long-term option for capacity increases. So I think we certainly want to save that comment as an idea on moving forward as well. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you for reading that, and we will definitely save that. Okay, we are just about at time here to go to public comment. So I would like to be able to do that. And Rob, I'm actually going to take back the screen from you because I will need to be able to show my screen so that I can show the timer. So if that is all right, and Kathleen, as the chair, nod over to you to see if that is okay with you, that we go ahead and begin, or at least offer the opportunity for a public comment. And if no, we don't have any takers, then we can do that differently. So I am going to hop over here, and Rob, if I think I can just.
Yeah, Susan, if you want to take screen presentation, and then I'm also going to change the Zoom settings to folks. So I'm going to take away some of your ability to mute and unmute deliberately, and then just as we manage the public comment. So don't be surprised if some things flash and change.
Okay, thank you for giving us a heads up about that. Okay, so hopefully what is sharing right now is a screen that says for those wishing to provide public comment. So again, if you are live streaming, please, and you do wish to make public comment, please go ahead and join the Zoom right now, and then we will see if we do have people that want to make public comment. I'm getting my timer up here, and then we can get going. So you can join by phone, or you can join us in the Zoom room right now. So it is just 4:01, and I am looking to see if there are any. If you are in the Zoom room, you should be able to raise your hand if you are a member of the public and would like to make public comment. So if you are a member of the public and would like to make public comment, please identify yourself by raising your hand. Anyone wish to make public comment? Okay, gonna wait maybe just another minute here because some people might be moving over from the live stream and maybe just we're considering this. So let's just pause for a moment here before we move on. And number one, see if anyone has any other comments from the group that they would like to make before we move into looking forward and wrap up. Anyone making public comment? Kathleen, I don't see anybody that is expressing an interest in that. So I think we can probably move ahead and either just go right into wrapping up or give people another moment if they have any other observations they'd like to make.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. All right. So a few more minutes then. Any other thoughts along the lines of what we were just discussing? Any other observations from today that you'd like to share? Anything as you think about, and some of you have commented a little bit about when we get together again and what would be helpful for us to enable you to have the most productive conversation possible. Would love to hear from any of you on anything on those lines, and especially if you haven't had an opportunity or taken the opportunity to comment or jump in, you're very welcome to do that now. Anything else? I think maybe we wore them out, Kathleen. It's been quite a discussion. I mean, really engaged conversation today. I am grateful for that. Erin, did you have something to add?
Oh, no, I just felt like I should go off camera for a second.
Oh, okay, great. Well, very happy to have you on camera. Always happy to have people on camera. So appreciate that. Clint, same thing from you. You weren't jumping in? Okay, great. Happy that you can turn your cameras on and not have me jump in there and ask if you have something to say. So you can feel safe to do that. All right. I would say then, Kathleen, why don't we go ahead and start to move into the looking forward. There may be additional questions as we get there as well. So if that sounds all right to you, we're going to hop over the public comment opportunity and go into the looking forward and the wrap up. So we have action items, next steps, and meeting number 3, and maybe talk a little bit about meeting number 3 from an action item standpoint. And I'm going to just check in with Michaela, who has been taking notes for us and documenting the conversation. I had noted some pieces of follow-up that we had that are buried in my notes here. Michaela, can you help us with any specific action items that we would have? Actually, I know one, it's a document that Glenn sent us, Governor Inslee's comments, and we did receive that, and we will forward that out to the group. We have some action items associated with the charter, trying to incorporate the comments we received today and get those factored in and then the charter returned. Are there other action items, Michaela or Lauren, that we need to note right now or that others want us to not forget?
Hi, Susan. The other action item that I'm tracking is just to get a screenshot of the notes from today's discussion out to participants as well.
Okay. Great. And we had a couple, certainly some requests for other kinds of information, and we will try to chase that down for the next meeting. Okay, so the next steps then, we do have this meeting that's going to be coming up on December 8th. I think Rob has some thoughts. He'll be facilitating that meeting, but Kathleen would also like to provide an opportunity for you to either weigh in on that, and we'll certainly give you the final word in any closing remarks. But do you have anything in particular about meeting 3 that you'd like to mention before Rob jumps in and makes some observations about that?
I heard a lot about looking at the current system and where the pinch points are as represented in some sort of map. I mean, Glenn, I also have heard that a little bit from you in terms of, you know, where is that need right now? And so I'm going to look to the group, because that's not a resource I have, to provide to us perhaps where that resource might be located and who would be most appropriate, or what group of people might be most appropriate to present that.
Thanks, Kathleen. So think about that. If you think that you would be that person or interested in that, we have had some really good information presentations that may have some of that, but again, rolling that all together and putting it in the way that some folks have expressed today that they'd like to see that, could certainly benefit from assistance there. Rob, do you want to speak a little bit about kind of what you're thinking for meeting 3? That might also help kind of inform where the group wants to put some energy and follow up on what Kathleen just said.
Yes. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Kathleen. Sarah, I saw that you went on video and unmuted. I don't know if you had a response to what Kathleen had asked there.
Yeah, I'm worried about obligating Lorna to something, but at the same time, I understand that Nexus is a rule that the utilities can help build out. I think it's a difficult question, and I know that part of what Tom presented was trying to get to some of that, and so maybe we can work offline to figure out what we could provide in addition to that. The conversation that I'm interested in is that barriers conversation. How do we break the barriers conversation down into specifics? Because I'm seeing that we're getting kind of at a halfway point in the meetings, and to take it from those broad statements into something more tangible, I think would be productive.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to use that as a segue, and that is exactly the plan. We have spent 2 days in shared learning mode, which is really important because the shared learning helped us understand where we go next. The meeting that we have I'm thinking about for meeting 3 is going to be where we go from shared learning to more shared agreement. And when we use the word agreement, it could mean we agree that we see this differently, but that's totally okay. That's the power of a broad-based group like this, is actually documenting what the perspectives look like. So what folks can anticipate is much less presentation, much more discussion about areas of convergence and areas of divergence. And so what folks can anticipate is that the facilitation staff are going to be working pretty closely with Joe and with Stu, and possibly reaching out to folks who have resources so we can pull materials together so that then we can anchor the conversation in materials. So for instance, I can envision a conversation where we potentially have a map that identifies what some of the capacity constraints look like. And then I can envision a conversation that we then talk about, well, what are some very specifics about these capacity constraints that we need to think about and talk about. And so we're going to begin diving much deeper into what those conversations look like. And I know Susan and I agreed not to talk about this in out loud, but I'm going to do it anyways because I changed my mind. We think that these 8-hour meetings can be really hard on folks, especially as we move towards much more discussion-oriented conversations. And so we want to float the idea of potentially having back-to-back 4-hour meeting days so that folks have both can accommodate schedules, but also potentially have the stamina to have higher intensity conversations for more hours. And we know that it's different than what we asked you to hold on your calendar, but we're going to maybe perhaps do a little due diligence, see if calendars allow that to happen. We might look to do, 3.5-hour, 4-hour meetings back to back. So that is it in terms of what's happening next, Kathleen and Susan.
Thanks, Rob. I see that Steve has his hand up and has got his video on, so I'm thinking he has something on his mind.
Yeah, it's actually, I was going to stay quiet until I heard Sarah's comment and then Rob's comment, which I violently agree with. I do think there is a need to begin focusing. To Rob's point on drilling down, which terminologists in DoD fully understand, completely agree that that need is there. But if I sound like a broken record, it is deliberate. And that is having some of that baseline. And again, not suggesting that we have the entire state mapped out at the wave top of where the gap may be or what the capacities may be. But to Rob's point and to Sarah's point, to drill down where we can actually take some of these bubble areas and say, well, in this area where we've got, I'm just throwing things out, XYZ substations and these three lines that are intersecting, we have so much capacity. Well, let's look at that for our discussions as a case study and saying, okay, what equities are there? Since that was raised multiple times, how would we deconflict these various interests? And what would the low-hanging fruit be? And what would some of the other barriers be? But we're not talking hypothetical anymore, right? We're drilling down with something that's tangible. And I think it will add a more robust, targeted discussion to the point that Sarah raised and to the point that Rob was just articulating. I think if the next session is truly intended and structured to allow a greater participation from the group members, I think having some of this basic baseline information, maybe in a bubble diagram, before that meeting, so the team members could look at it, come prepared, and then we could focus on drilling down in some of those areas. So we're talking about tangible, actual areas with actual equities when input's provided. So, okay, so now I've shared a nickel with the team, but I had to, I'm sorry.
No,
back to you, Rob and Susan.
Thank you. Appreciate that perspective, Steve. I'm excited to be part of the planning for the next meeting, and whether that's 2 4-hour sessions back to back or however we do that. And I agree with Rob, those will likely be more intensive conversations. So we'll certainly work with all of you and Kathleen as to the best way to make that happen in a process that is conducive to that. So thank you for that. Any other observations that anyone would like to make before we turn it over to Kathleen to make those inspirational, motivating closing remarks that we know that Kathleen is very capable of doing? Anything else from anyone else? All right, then I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen, and thank you from my perspective as the facilitator today, just for really appreciate your engagement, really appreciate your cooperation and the way that you talked with each other, even if you weren't agreeing with each other. It was very respectful and very productive, and I thank you very much for that. So Kathleen, over to you for the close.
Thank you. What an expectation you set up for me there. But I do want to thank everybody for participation today. I know it was a lot of listening, and active listening is what I saw from everyone. And I do agree, we probably wore everybody out by the end of the day. But I think the importance was very much that we have a shared understanding, both of what the overall challenge is and also what the diversity of views are. And so it is time to get down to looking more closely at where the gaps are and where the challenges and barriers are to filling those gaps. So that's what I see as moving forward. I thank you, Sarah, for saying that perhaps we can work with you to get some information pulled from utilities. I'm also going to look to Glenn and Commerce and probably UTC to see if we have additional information within the state government family that would be helpful in really trying to identify those gaps, because it seems to me that the smart way to work forward is to see where the existing infrastructure is and how we can build that up before we look then to what the options might be for new infrastructure going forward. So thank everybody for participation, and Susan and Rob, if you are going forward to poll people on time considerations and whether or not 2 days in a row works better as part days for people, certainly please move forward with that poll, and we'll see what the options are for the group. But thanks again for participation today, and look forward to what we uncover in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.